tonight, huh? We lost our group tonight, huh? Up to Snow Mountain.
They went to Snow Mountain.
Okay, we're going to pick up again chapter 9 of the Avatamsaka in the verses, continuing Manjushris. Manjushris are the speakers. I'm going to overlap, continue with the verse we started on last week and then go into the next one. So I'm looking at Jieto Ming Heng Sure, that section of text. In mine, it's around 29, 30?
28, 29.
28, 29. Okay, slowly. Jieto Ming Heng Sure, Wu Shu Wu Deng Lun, Shijian Juying Liang, Qiu Guo Bu Ke De. Next verse, which is continue. Fu Fei Shijian Yun, Jie Chu Sheng Si Fa, Shu Fa Bu Neng Cheng, Gu Hao Ren Shi Zi. We worked in the translation last week, decided to do some moving around a bit of reading like this. Liberated, untied, awake, clear in all they do. They, the Buddhas, are uncountable, incomparable, using all kinds of worldly knowledge or common knowledge and logic. You might seek but would never fathom them. And the second verse continues off the theme of the first, explaining why we couldn't fathom them. The Buddha is not the worldly skandhas, nor the realms of places, or the dharmas of birth and death, or the phenomena of birth and death, if you want here. He does not fall within dharmas of reckoning and so-called a lion among men. We already did some discussion on the limitations of the knowledge. Sometimes in the text, there's different ways of looking at learning, knowledge, understanding. As with a lot of the, I should say, investigations, the theories, the mappings of the human mind and how it works and human behavior, this tradition is very, very rich. And one way of looking at least as I learned it, modes of knowledge dealing with the world, or what we translate above as common knowledge. One is called pratyaksha. The second one is called anumana, and the third is called agama. And basically this is, the first one, the pratyaksha, is a direct perception. It's what we see, quote, or understand directly by looking at it through our sense faculties, the perception of things. The second one, the anumana, is called, better translation of inference. We infer. We don't see it directly, but we can literally move into it through a combination of deliberation, weighing of facts, and coming to a conclusion. It's not definitive, but it's logical. And the third one is called agama, and here it's very interesting because this is a knowledge that is attributed to the sages, the authority of the sages, which would include all of the, basically, Tripitaka, the sutras, the shastras, Vinaya, and they're all included in this. Again, the key here is, even though this seems to be world-transcending knowledge, even that cannot penetrate what's being described here. That's why it says cannot fathom them. So this takes us to how then is it to be known? How is this to be known? And let's just hold that question for now. But assuming what we directly see, what we think we understand through our perception, what we get at through inference, through logic, through the collection of data and drawing conclusions, statistical probabilities and so forth, and even what we are able to apprehend by reading the sutras, the shastras, and studying the Vinaya, still this doesn't get at it. One way of looking at the last category, the agama category, is that it's sometimes in other texts compared to a finger pointing to the moon. The texts themselves do not confer truth, nor are they to mistaken for the truth, but they're simply pointing to what is known directly through prajna. Therefore, there's a famous passage from the Lankavatara Sutra which describes someone using the finger to indicate an object, and the foolish person mistaking the fingertip for the object. And this is where the famous Zen expression comes from, the finger pointing to the moon, again from this metaphor found in the Lankavatara Sutra. If one uses a finger to point to the moon, but the person fixated is on the tip of the finger, and will never see the moon, in the same way we use the sutras, shastras, and Vinaya to indicate, to point to. what is true, because it's caught up in the realm of words and language and symbols. And it's very useful, but it isn't the direct realization of the true. So this is how I would interpret that third area. Even what we call our perception of knowing and seeing, we now know, and we've known for quite a long time, that this isn't exactly how things really are, but more how things seem to us through the various filters that we have, both psychological and personal, but also cultural, and also historical. We know now that perception itself, this is from neuropsychology, is some combination of inference and memory put together. That the amount of data we're exposed to is overwhelming to our sense faculties. And therefore, over time, we form patterns through inference and memory, and we're able to condense things down to what seem to us as direct perceptions, but really are sort of very quick gluing together of things as they seem to us through a combination of quick inference and memory. And that's why when that faculty of inference and memory starts to break down, say with something like Alzheimer's, then the very nature of perception also starts to fall apart. For example, identifying people that we know. We know them through inference and memory, not just in the catalogs of the photos we keep, but in this constant holding together of a fleeting reality through this very quick memory function we have in inference. But if the memory faculty is deficient more than it normally is, because it's not reliable totally, even when it's functioning well, we directly look at people and we don't recognize them anymore. We don't perceive them as father, mother, sister, brother, or friend. So we can see this is where the passage is going, of course, the next line about worldly skandhas and so forth. This is talking about the psychophysical dimension of how we put together reality, and then, of course, the realms of places and so forth. Master Wa's commentary on this is very interesting. He says, when one becomes a Buddha, the 5 worldly skandhas are already empty. They don't have any nature of their own. We see that these too are projections held up by this flimsy identity conscious-making apparatus that we have. So it isn't within the Dharma of the 5 skandhas that we investigate the Buddha. Then he says, nor the realms of places or dharmas of birth and death. Again, the commentary, the Buddha transcended not only the 5 skandhas, but also the 6 sense organs and the 6 sense faculties, which together are called the 12 places. Adding to the 6, we get 6 consciousnesses, and that makes up 18. So the sense organs, the sense objects, and the consciousness that unites between them are called the 18 realms. This is basically our mind-body functioning as it understands and fabricates and holds together a conditioned reality. It isn't seemingly to us conditioned, but what the text is saying, what I'm getting into with this psychology, is in fact it is. And again, I would say the closest corollary or correspondent to this view is again what's starting to emerge in neuroscientific research. And it's actually not saying exactly the same thing. I don't think that would be fair, but it's saying there's so much congruence between that view of the nature of reality that it isn't something out there, but it's an interactive, is what neuroscience refers to. It's an interactive reality. It comes into being through the action of the observer and what is observed. And in fact, it's very hard to distinguish between the two because they are so highly interactive and not separate. I could go into this in some detail. I don't want to dwell on it tonight, but this is to say, this view here, if you say, well, it's sort of a religious Buddhist view, I would argue that in fact it's not. It's a Buddhist presentation of the nature of how we understand and know. But it does have correspondence and correlation to what we understand in the realm of the human mind and the neuropsychological functions we engage in. So, and the master goes on, he says, these 5 skandhas, 12 places, and 18 realms are the dharmas or phenomena of coming into being, passing away, of conditioned reality. One cannot use them to understand the Buddha, and then he quotes the text, because the Buddha does not fall within these dharmas of reckoning. You can't use the dharmas that can be numbered or calculated, logic or seemingly possibilities or even probabilities to understand the state of the Buddha. And so is called a line indicating an outstanding individual beyond the experiences of beings in the 9 realms, referring to the other realms of existence. So this is, what it's both describing is the nature of how our mind works, how it functions in great detail. And of course, you could spend a whole semester just looking into the skandhas, the realms and the places, and how they work, and look at the shastras and the commentaries on this. It's absolutely fascinating. In my experience, I'm still, quote, trying to wrap my head around it. And the more I study it, the deeper and more insightful it seems. I would consider it, from what I've known, to be the highest psychology, the highest study of the psychological functioning of people. And this idea that we are seeing things through preconceived patterns and habits of the skandhas and consciousness and the layers of consciousness. This is the habituation tendencies. This has gone into great detail in a text called the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, which describes the workings of consciousness. And interestingly, it's the misworkings or the misfunctioning of those workings that leads to the ordinary experience of reality. When that functioning is refined and perfected, it's Buddha. It's seeing things. So it's the same apparatus, but used differently. So I want to really stress, this comes back to this idea of non-dual. It's not like the ordinary mind and this mind are two. They're different functionings of the same capacity. And that's why it says in the Avatamsaka, within the ordinary mind, one discovers, one activates the Buddha mind. It doesn't come from outside. But this idea that we seldom encounter things that are radically new, but we're always encountering them through our presets, through our habitual patterns of perceiving that we set up. I want to quote you somebody who was onto this over 100 years ago, and a philosopher, psychologist I quite like, William James, who's considered to be one of the, if not the, leading exponent of what's called pragmatism. And this is a quote from him describing how we both encounter something new, but we don't take it whole. We adjust it and bring it in. And it goes to what I was talking about last week, a little bit of the paradigm paralysis. We're in a certain paradigm where our sense faculties and our biases and beliefs and convictions are all kind of more or less set and aligned. And then data that comes in has to work its way through and be accepted by and assimilated through those patterns. And this is his quote. It's really wonderful. He says, "Our minds thus grow in spots, like grease spots. The spots spread, but we let them spread as little as possible." So he says this new information is a little spot that comes into the fabric and it spreads, but we try to keep them from spreading as little as possible. We keep unaltered as much of our old knowledge, as many of our old prejudices and beliefs as we can. So on one hand, James would assert, yes, we are curious, but we're cautiously curious. We're not totally curious. And we want to be comfortably curious, which means we don't want to be exposed to any more that's really going to upset or rock our boat. This is why both in the realm of science and in human behavior, We are so slow to adapt and change. We are adaptable and we can change, but we have this inertia. And this is what Buddhism calls attachment. And so he says, we want to keep their old prejudices and beliefs as long as we can. The novelty, the newness soaks in. It stains the ancient mass, but it is also tinged by what it absorbs. This is really interesting. It comes in, but it's also modified and altered by what absorbs it. Our past apperceives and cooperates. And in the new equilibrium in which each step forward in the process of learning terminates, it happens relatively seldom that a new fact is added raw. More usually it is embedded, cooked as one might say, or stewed down in the sauce of the old. Now this really, if you look at this, it says a lot. If you look at, say, food across the world, when food comes from one culture to another, it doesn't come in raw, so to speak. I'm sorry I didn't mean it as a pun. It doesn't come in raw as it was cooked and everything there. It's modified. There's a kind of fusion that goes on. It's mixed with the other flavors and so forth. And so it has a Mexican or a Chinese or an Italian. And often you'll find people who come from the original culture say, that isn't pizza, or that isn't jiaozi. This is your version of something. And the same is true of, quote, American food that goes abroad. One experience I had is just something as simple as peanut butter. If you've traveled the world and you've asked for peanut butter in different cultures, except, the modern, what do we call it, the modern interconnected global whatever, where it's all permeating everywhere, where McDonald's are everywhere. But even that, you go to McDonald's in a different country, it's not quite the same thing. And McDonald's in Calcutta or Beijing is not like, Berkeley. But in any event, what I'm talking about here is that even when you have the recipes, and even when you know sort of what it's supposed to be like, something happens in that process where it's embedded in the old. It's mixed with the old. So he's saying, not only is this, I'm saying this is true of food, it's also true of ideas like democracy. Democracy in one area means one thing. When exported to another, it becomes something else. And the same is true of Buddhism. The Buddhism that you encounter, say, in China or Thailand or Burma, and the Buddhism that you encounter here in America are cooked down. It's cooked down in the sauce of the new here. And so it's not quite the same. There's a greater attention to details of Buddhism in those countries that you don't find here, and also a corresponding attention and emphasis on certain factors here you don't find there. I don't want to go into this in great detail, but you get my point of what James is going at. And so too, the Buddha would say, day to day and thought to thought, movement to movement, we are constantly filtering, interpreting, and adjusting what comes into us. So we seldom see things as they really are. We see them as we want them to be, as we hope them to be, and to a large extent as we fear they might be. And so as a result, this whole thing leads up to what I'm going to get to later, hopefully maybe in the next verse, Wangxiang, which is translated as false thoughts, but it actually is much deeper than that. It is a distorted, consciously or unconsciously, perception of reality that's constantly working. It's not just an individual wrong thought, but it's a orientation, a pattern of thinking that at its base is off because it's caught up in the realms of places and skanas with the self and what belongs to me, and all of that then creates this very structured, preset paradigm paralysis. Okay. What I also find interesting, this is just a side note, William James was, as I said, a philosopher and psychologist. he's worth reading. People should take a look at him. He's got, he used to give talks to the undergraduates in the dormitories at Harvard when he was a professor there on, meaning of life, why not commit suicide, all kinds of topics, and very lively. He has a philosophy of education that I think still is very relevant and useful. And his talks to teachers is another one of his works that you could really benefit from looking at. One of his major works was called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which was an examination of the major, not only religions, but religious, psychological, philosophical tropes and types existent at that time, and going at a deep psychological analysis of religion rather than just listing of them. And religious experience is what he was interested in, how the religious impulse or the spiritual impulse manifest across time and in different situations. To some extent, this is what Houston Smith was basing his on when he held the idea that the religious impulse is almost not only inborn but hardwired. It manifests differently across time and cultures, but that spiritual, religious longing, impulse, whatever that is homoversal, pan-universal in the sense. This is where James is coming from too. But in any event, what was interesting is when Buddhism first made its entry into America in a major way, it was really in the 1890s. It had made inroads before, but in the 1890s, because of this Parliament of World Religions that was held in Chicago, along with what we call the World's Fair, that was called then the Columbian Exposition in honor of Columbus, right? 1892, 93, 1692, 1492. Okay, so it's a Columbian exhibition. Anyhow, and one of the exhibitions had all the technology that science had made available, showing it on display with human beings beating their chests for all the progress they made. Somebody else said, well, we should have one with ideas. We should have an exposition of ideas, in which included the world's religions and not just things. And so this Parliament of World Religions was the first time where you had a large number of non-Christian, non-Judeo-Christian representatives coming together. And the first time Americans could hear and see them, it was quite the thing. All the newspapers covered it. And it's the first time that you had talks and presentations by Buddhists in their own words, in their own person, not interpreted and filtered through missionaries and scholars even. And anyhow, one of the people that came from Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, was a Buddhist adept called Anagarika Dharmapala. Now, Dharmapala meant he was intermediate between lay and total left home. This was a position he created. It was a white robe he wore, where he took a certain amount of precepts but hadn't fully ordained. He fully ordained later in his life, but at this point, he was trying to put forth a kind of Buddhist figure that wasn't worldly but hadn't completely left home either, because he wanted to have a kind of engaged presence. So he came to the Parliament. And well, it's interesting. I'm digressing. It's a lot of fun. He had this, what the papers called a swarthy complexion. He had this beard and long hair and this white robe. And many of the people there, the Victorians, saw him as Jesus come again. He looked like their biblical notion of Jesus. And they thought, here's the Jesus from the East. And of course, it worked well, because when he was in Sri Lanka, before he had what he called a neo-nationalist movement, which is bringing Buddhism back into Sri Lanka at this time, because Christianity has so converted large segments of the population. His move was to bring Buddhism back, a Buddhist revival. In fact, this is where the Buddhist flag comes from. If you see the Buddhist flag with all the colors, this was one of the products of this movement to create an international Buddhist presence. Anyhow, but he was in catechism school with the Christian missionaries. So he had memorized chapter and verse of the Old and New Testament. He had it under his belt. So he could give these wonderful talks and make these comparisons and contrasts with Christianity even better than many of the Protestant ministers there, because he had all committed to memory. Anyhow, it was interesting. One of the things that shocked him, now I'm really digressing, but it's fun. One of the things that really shocked him was the amount of meat eating. He couldn't fathom, because Chicago at that time was not only the capital of Illinois in terms of the whole United States, of meatpacking industries. These were the slaughterhouses were. This is where Upton Sinclair wrote his famous muckraking journal. What was that called? I'll have to think of it.
The Jungle?
The Jungle, right. The Jungle. And so one of his sponsors was a fellow I was studying named Paul Karras, and at one of these huge assemblies, Anagarika Dharmapala just got up and lambasted the audience for eating meat, eating cows. And there was no applause, and he couldn't figure out why, because usually he was used to a little bit of an ovation, if not a standing ovation. And my friend Paul Karras said to him afterwards, he says, do you know the idea of upaya in Buddhism? You have to use that here. You cannot just come out full force and say what you just said to people who have been eating meat for generations here. He says, find an expedient way. So he was on a learning curve as well. But part of his trip took him to visit Harvard. So after this Parliament happened, people like Paul Karras and others put money together and offered invitation to these Buddhists from around the world, Japan and Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, to come to the United States, especially those who knew English well enough, and to do what they called a reverse missionary movement. In other words, instead of having the missionary thrust go from Anglo-America out to the, quote, and the language they used were these people who were sitting in darkness, unaware of the truth and so forth. Their movement was to have those Buddhist and Hindu representatives come to the United States and enter into the discussion, enter into the debate. And their idea was this would make the world a better place, not only if they knew each other, but it would level the playing ground a little, because they've been misrepresented as being not awake, not enlightened, savages, and so on and so forth. And of course, once they saw them in Chicago, they realized that wasn't the case. And now there was interest and enthusiasm. And this reverse missionary movement went on really until about World War I. And when World War I hit, the strife and the conflict of international fighting was so bad, and that war was such a, how shall I say it, dampening of the human optimism and spirit, that kind of stopped at that point in the 1920s, and we don't see it again until the late 50s and 60s again, Buddhism coming back. But that early period was interesting. Anyhow, part of his tour took him to Harvard, and he was in the back at Harvard listening to William James's class on psychology. And William James spotted him, recognized him, that he had been this person who spoke really well from the Parliament. And here's a quote. He said, he invited Dharmapala up and he says, take my chair and I shall sit with my students. I, the professor, will sit with the students. You are better equipped to lecture on psychology than I am, is what he said to Dharmapala. And Dharmapala then graciously accepted and began to lay out some elements and some aspects of Buddhist doctrine and teachings. And at the end of that talk, James then turned to his students and remarked, and he said, this is the psychology everybody will be studying 25 years from now. Very interesting. Maybe not 25 years because of all that intervened, but certainly it is now, since the 1960s, become more and more prescient what he was saying. And in fact, some people have pointed out that Buddhism came in waves of interest into the United States, and one of the first ones in the 60s and the 70s through the discipline and interest in psychology. and human psychology and so forth. And then a second wave came with the interest in hard sciences like physics. You had the Tao of physics and this interest on that. And then later, I think the phase we're in now is the neuroscience, and on those comparisons is how it's resonating. But in any event, so I think that more or less covers those two verses. If we want to, we maybe can go on to the next one. Yeah. So just in Chinese, 其性本空寂，内坏诸解脱，利益切妄念，无等法如是。The English of this would be his or their nature is basically empty and still. Inside and out, he is completely liberated. Apart from all false thoughts, the text, this is your translation, you're looking, the unequal dharma is also like this. I would maybe make some adjustments here. We can stick with the empty and still as long as we render this as the positive state of unbound, unattached, and free from all delusion and confusion. Empty means free of conditioned existence, and still means calm, quiet, clear, alert. Sometimes you talk about it in the wonderful stillness of a moonlit night or something like this, or the stillness of the waters. That's what it means. The empty, though, of course, is referring to free of attachments. And this is not empty in the sense of void or vacant, but actually not lacking anything, not needing anything, completely whole and complete. So empty is just sunyata, but it doesn't mean, and unfortunately it's difficult to render into English, so that's why I think for the time being, some kind of commentary is going to be necessary when we use that word. Inside and out, completely liberated. This is where I would maybe change this. Apart from all false thoughts, it's just here in the text, it's li iche wang nian. Wang is false, nian is thinking or thought. Iche all, li not connect to, apart from that, distant from. But here I think I would translate as apart from all wrong thinking rather than false thoughts. False thoughts indicates sort of like there's false thoughts and there's true thoughts. And often it's used in a sort of judgmental sense. Oh, that's a false thought. You had a thought of anger, a thought of desire, or a thought of coveting or so forth, and that's a false thought. It can sometimes be used in that way if you're using it in a therapeutic teaching way and there's a context for the understanding that you're training your mind, and your relationship, say, with your teacher is in the training of your mind, you're starting to spot these impulses, these thoughts, if you will, desires, almost knee-jerk as they move. And then the teacher will point it out and say, that is a false thought. But here, there's a lot more to it. And that's why I would do wrong thinking. Let me share some of you the commentary first on this. Just again from my teacher. He's saying the Buddha nature is fundamentally empty and still. There is no mind, and outside there is no body. There is no mind and body separation. This is the empty and still, means unattached, unbound. Inside and out, there are no attachments, no grasping, no clinging. There's also no attachment to dharmas or to the view of a self. So this is the emptiness. But that emptiness means the fullness of one's being manifest, because it's empty of the wrong or the false self. Inside you contemplate the mind as no mind, and outside you contemplate the states as no states. You basically, like the Vajra Sutra, you watch the rise and fall of conditioned dharmas like dreams, illusions, bubble shadows. They are there and yet they're not substantially real. You contemplate them thus. If you contemplate the mind even as no mind, then the mind will attain liberation. If you contemplate states as no states, you can certainly attain liberation from those states. This thing then having to do, maybe make a little argument for wrong. Wangxiang is one way of saying that the text here uses Wang Nian. Xiang, Nian, these are basically mental functionings. Also, you can use Wang Qing as in emotions. And this is also used interchangeably. Wang Nian, Wang Xiang, Wang Qing. And basically what's being described here is the sense, we're going back to the realms now. The sense objects, sights, smells, sounds, taste, tangible tactile things, and even what we conjure up in our imagination. These are all received through as contact with these external objects who are sense faculties. So eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and sixth consciousness, if you will. Sight, sound, smells, taste, the objects of touch, the tactile, and dharmas, small d, which are the objects of this sixth consciousness, the discursive mad mind. These six are constantly vibrating, constantly bouncing in between each other. And they are interpreted then through this diluted way. And they are then turned into mind tendencies or habituations. And this is what it means to be attached and bound and caught, because we take them to be real, and in fact they aren't, but we're holding them together with a habitual action of mind. This is Wangxiang. This is the wrong thinking. It's a wrong use of the mind. And the failure to recognize the true nature of things, because we attach and set these things up and cling to them, even though they seem to come, they seem to stay, they seem to go, and then they're gone. We keep producing this. We're caught in this, another way of looking at a consciousness samsara, a constantly going on. Day to night, we just constantly grasping everywhere. Just grasping with the eyes, ears, nose, tongue. We can't hold. We fear we're going to lose. It inevitably fades. We feel a kind of angst and disappointment, and then rather than reflecting, we just keep it going again, and we grab something new. We go from objects of food, of stimulation, of relationships, of jobs, of locations, of dwellings, of clothes. This constant busy, grasping, attaching, losing, grasping, attaching, losing. What Huineng calls the frantic passage through life. The result is we fail to recognize the true nature of these things, that they are, in fact, our own creations, our own grasping. And as a result, there's attachment forms to the object, a passion or desire, both to hold it and fear that we're going to lose it. Or even in the mental processes as conceptualizing, evaluating, and discriminating among all this. And that gives rise to a diluted perspective of the world. This is what's called wuming or avidya. Not seeing things clearly. Wuming is translated often as ignorance, but it's not a judgmental ignorance. It means a wrong way of perceiving, a misconstruing of things, a fundamental misconstruing. You could also translate wuming as without light, because an avidya means with not seeing. So rather than use this judgmentally, say you're having false thinking, and scolding about this. You actually do it more clinically and professionally, like a doctor, and say, your mind is not functioning well. It's not working properly. It's misperceiving, it's misunderstanding these illusory things as real. And as a result of this, you're attaching and grasping to things that cannot ever be held. And as a consequence, there's frustration and suffering and so forth. This is Da Wangshan. This is what it means to have false thinking. So we're out of time tonight. I just wanted to deal with that a little bit because I think it's fundamentally important. Because it doesn't mean just, I get rid of that thought and I get rid of this thought. If I have a thought of wanting, to get drunk or to get high, that's a false thought. I'll push it down. I have a thought of craving and desire and lust for gambling or sex or whatnot. I'll push it down, push it down. What it's talking about, Wangshan, is the very deeper pattern, the formative pattern, the ground from which those kinds of thoughts come. But those thoughts in themselves are really symptoms of a deeper Wangshan, a deeper wrong perception. So therefore, in cultivation, it isn't sufficient to clamp down on your false thoughts or cut off your false thoughts. This is not what it's about. You actually have to break through to the ground where these patterns of attachment and misunderstanding fundamentally deep are arising. This, according to Han Shan, is not an easy thing to do, but it is the work of people trying to unite with their spiritual nature. This is the returning. And this is what's described in the text here tonight, is that a Buddha, an awakened one, has in fact been able to do this, has gone down to that deep ground, clearly seen it, straightened it out, and come back with the mind fully functioning. And that's where I think we'll get to the next verse. And just as a hint, what the result is of this, constantly happy. That's how the next verse starts. Constantly happy, contemplating the true nature of things, still quiescence, characterized by one mark, non-duality, and the mind doesn't increase or decrease, and the manifestation of the spiritual powers comes from this. So you see, by going down to the smallest of those places where this forms, reversing that and using it well, I think the takeaway tonight, though, is not only liberation, but happiness. This is something we also desperately want and seek. And I think what the text is saying psychologically tonight, if you really want it, this is the garden you go to claim that. It can't come from things outside. It can only come from this interior reorientation. So I'll stop for tonight. Normally I would ask one of the monks to come up and talk, but all the monks are gone to the mountain. They went off to Snow Mountain, which may in fact be in snow right now, I would guess. It's in the state of Washington area, high up. Dharma Master Hung Lai is anchoring that place, and the group that's been doing the monastic immersion here went up there for a couple of weeks. So wish them well. That being the case, there's no announcement that I know of. I guess tomorrow Heng Sure will have his lecture online, the Avatamsaka lecture. Anything else I should say?
It's the last day of the Guanyin session, right?
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
So
The Guanyin session is wrapping up.
the 7-day Guanyin session is wrapping up at the City of 10,000 Buddhas and online, right?
Yeah.
They did it online.
Two courses still have the Buddha names, recitation, I think at 12 and 2 to 3 p.m. I think that's still going.
From 12 to 3?
No, from 12 to 12:30, that's the first one. And then from 2 to 3:30.
From 12 to 12:30, from 2 to 3:30, there's a Buddha recitation here at the monastery, but again online, correct?
It will be online, yeah.
Okay, so those of you who know the online schedule and how to access it, I don't. You can get it. We'll do the transference now in English. Could you give me a transference card from the back? Yeah. Normally we have a chorus of voices, and tonight there's only one or two of us. Yeah, thank you. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.